All right, guys, so this is your last lesson of this unit before you have your test. So when you get done with this lesson, you have your Kahoot left to do, and watch that movie if you haven't done it yet. And that movie will help you. So following the American Revolution, this is going to be some review stuff for a lot of it. Following the American Revolution, we're having some problems with our economy. Prices in tobacco, indigo, and rice have plummeted severely because Britain is refusing to buy any of our crops anymore. Because of that, we have to find a new crop. The fallback crop for a long time had been long staple cotton. Problem is, you could only grow long staple cotton in the barrier islands. If you notice it, it looks big, it looks fluffy, there's not a whole lot of seeds in it. This is short staple cotton. This is what could be grown pretty much anywhere. Problem was, it's extremely difficult to remove the seeds. We've talked about this. So, the solution was Eli Whitney making the cotton gin. South Carolina paid $50,000. They bought the patent for the cotton gin. That's the permit to make the product. So anyone in South Carolina can make it without cost. We actually put the blueprint for it in libraries across our state so that we could have it. So anybody in our state could have it. The Cotton Belt, that's the region where cotton was grown, stretches from South Carolina, actually stretches all the way up to New Jersey, down through Texas. Every bit of available land was being used to produce cotton. Cotton was now the king of the South. It used to be rice was king, now it's cotton. Cotton has taken over the throne. The race was now on to get as many slaves into South Carolina as possible, as quickly as possible. In 1788, when the Commerce Compromise was made, part of the Commerce Compromise was slavery would be protected for 20 years until the year 1808. Well, we're getting close to that. South Carolina, because of how little we used slaves because of the fall of rice and indigo, had actually put a temporary ban on importing slaves into our state. Well, they removed that ban in 1803. So they have from the end of 1803 to the beginning of 1808 to bring in as many slaves as possible. So they really only have 4 years to bring those slaves in. So from December of 1803 until the beginning of 1808, they start importing as many slaves as possible. This right here shows how much cotton production jumped and how much work they were having to do. In 1800, we had, well, I can't read the numbers on that. Looks like around 800,000 slaves, but there was only 4,000 bales of cotton being produced. So that means each slave had to produce 5/1000ths of a bale of cotton. Go forward 20 years. The amount of slaves go up, but so does the amount of cotton. And each slave now has to produce around 5/100ths of a bale of cotton. So the amount of work per slave has increased by 10 times. 20 years later, amount of work a slave has to do has increased 10 times again. So a slave's life is 100 times harder in 1840 than it was in 1800. By 1860, each slave had to produce a bale of cotton by themselves a year. So basically a slave's life is going to be 200 times harder in 1860 than it was in 1800. So the work, the lives of slaves is becoming increasingly more and more hard. Even though most whites didn't own slaves, it's really important that you guys realize that. Most white people in the South could not even come close to affording slaves. So it wasn't most white people owned them. Most of the people that did own slaves weren't planters either. A planter is somebody that owns 20 or more slaves. Most slaves worked in the fields. They were field hands. They did not work in homes. They worked out on the fields. Although there were some that produced particular skills and trades like cooking, smithing, carpentry, field hands were classified by the amount of work they did. You had quarter hands, they worked a quarter of the day. Half hands worked half a day. Full hands worked from sun up till sundown. It all depended on the age and health of the slaves. Often many of the older slaves became the slave drivers. Those were the slaves that ensured other slaves did the work. They were the ones that pushed everybody else. If you have watched the movie that I told you to watch, that's Zeke. That's the YouTube link. Zeke is a slave driver. Slaves were very, very harsh. They were very hard on their workers. Cotton plantations were operated under the gang system. The gang system, man, you worked from sun up to sundown. While rice plantations usually worked on the task system. That means you're given a certain number of tasks to do. Once you've completed those tasks, you're done for the day. You complete 2 tasks, you don't have to work tomorrow. So that rice plantations, even though the tasks were, now you got to think about this. The tasks were designed to take you all day. So if you're going to complete 2, you busted your butt to get them done. Although some plantations rewarded slaves for good behavior, most of the time slaves were controlled by punishment. Harry McMillan was a slave. He gained his freedom, learned how to read and write, and he wrote about what the punishments that he saw. He said the punishments were whipping, putting you in stocks, making you wear irons and chains at work, which are going to chafe on your hands and cut to your bones. They had a collar that would put around your neck with 2 horns like cow horns so you could not lie down. It also stops you from escaping because if you try and run away, it catch in the bushes. If you've watched the movie Brother Future that I put the link for, you will see a slave at the beginning, in that very beginning jail cell at the auction, before he goes up to auction, that's wearing those. Sometimes they dug a hole with a well, or like a well with a door on top. This they called a dungeon, and they would leave you in it for 2 or 3 weeks or a month, sometimes just until you died. Just seeing this treatment was enough to make most slaves do what they were told. Men and women were tasked with the same jobs. It did not matter whether you're male or female. Bad weather, illness had no effect unless it was extremely harsh weather. Most illness, they're going to make you work anyway. Larger plantations might have slaves as butlers, as maids, or house servants. These would most often be the lighter-skinned slaves. These slaves, even though they received better food and clothing, they worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you get called on, you showed up. Because if you didn't, you're going to work in the field. The biggest plantations also employed slaves as blacksmiths and carpenters as well. And you would sometimes hire them out to other plantations. You would rent your slaves to another plantation to make money off of them. Even with the enormous increase in slave in the early 1800s, the amount of slaveholders in the South was still extremely small. In fact, you guys need to understand, only 1 out of every 3 whites in the South owned any slaves at all. And of that, less than 1/8 of them would be considered planters. A person who owned 20 more slaves. The planters controlled the government because only they had the spare time to deal with political activities. So in this, if you look at this, this is 1/3 of the South's white population. Out of that 1/3, most, or half of that, so half of 1/3 would be 1/6. 1/6 of all white people only owned 1 to 4 slaves. This right here, this little section represents the planters. All right, so that would be something like, I don't know, 1/20th would own that many slaves. So most people were not near that rich. In fact, of the 1/3, 3/4 of them only owned like around 5 slaves. So they don't have many slaves. If you don't have many slaves, you're going to treat them a lot better because you can't afford to replace them. In fact, if you only owned 1 slave, you're more than likely out in the field working right beside them because you have to get the work done. And they more than likely stayed, in a little room attached to your house. They ate the same food that you did because you couldn't afford to get anything else. Most Southerners fell into the category of yeomen. These were small landowning farmers that hoped one day they could be able to reach the economic and political status of planters. Yeomen would work in the fields with their families, and if they happened to own a slave or a few slaves, they're working beside them as well in the fields. While there were rich and middle class whites, there were also very, very poor whites. They would survive on the land in which short staple cotton just wouldn't grow. These men were called po buckra. They were so poor that slaves would make fun of them. They survived by hunting, gathering, doing small jobs, and just earning enough to survive. In that 4-year period of time where they start importing slaves into South Carolina, 39,000 new slaves were brought into our state. That's how fast they were importing. In 4 years, basically they're importing about 10,000 slaves a year. Along with law changes to allow importation of slaves, other changes were needed to deal with the huge loads of cotton that are being brought in. They set aside $1.9 million for construction of roads and canals. Every canal built in South Carolina except for one, which is the Columbia Canal, were complete failures. Major cities were built along the fall line, which is why you have different rivers. You had Hamburg on the Savannah River. Hamburg will eventually become the city of North Augusta. You have Columbia on the Congaree, Camden on the Wateree, and Cheraw on the Petey. All of these cities were built on the fall line because you transport the cotton by wagon to the fall line, then you put it on boat and move it to the ocean. All right, so your essential question for this lesson: how did one invention impact the history of South Carolina as well as the United States? That invention's the cotton gin. How does it change things? Without the cotton gin, does slavery die off by itself? It's possible. Without the cotton gin, the African American population of our country, does it become what it was? Without the cotton gin, do we have a civil war? So talk about how this one invention dramatically affects things. Without the cotton gin, the up and low country, do they ever share power? Does the low country stay in complete control of everything? So there are lots of things to think of there. Make sure that you guys have answered all your questions. Make sure you guys do your Kahoot. If you have any questions, email me. Remember, you guys have a test when you come back. This is the last lesson for the unit. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to y'all later.